It's a decision that changed the course of history. The Chilcot Inquiry, unveiling 7 years of findings on Tony Blair's decision to back George W. Bush in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The premise, weapons of mass destruction that were never found. The consequence, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis killed in a bitter civil war, 179 UK servicemen and women, and a political vacuum that allowed the forefathers of ISIS to thrive. We're going to look at the report's damning conclusions and how much the Iraq War has scarred Britain, pitting Tony Blair's New Labour against the anti-war wing of his party that's now taken over under Jeremy Corbyn, how Iraq has made all of Britain a little more gun-shy, for instance, when it came to bombing raids in Syria back in 2013, and how it's changed how Britain sees itself and its role on the world stage, a question that's all the more timely in the wake of the vote to leave the European Union. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what's been a moment of truth for Britain this Wednesday. With us from London, Chris Nineham, founding member of the Stop the War Coalition, alongside the likes of current Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, nice to be here.
He worked in a previous life on UN affairs at the French Foreign Ministry. Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil, Paris Bureau Chief for the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
She was covering Westminster back in 2003. France 24 senior correspondent, Melissa Bell. Nice to see you. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter the hashtag F24debate. Too soon an invasion, a threat by Saddam Hussein that was exaggerated, advice on post-war planning that George Bush largely ignored. Those just some of the findings of a report that's harsher than first thought, but still steers clear of weighing in on the legal responsibility of Tony Blair. Ellen Gainsworth has more.
The findings of the Chilcot Inquiry are damning for former Prime Minister Tony Blair. The report says that Saddam Hussein posed no imminent threat to the UK at the time of the invasion, and that the chaos that followed in Iraq should have been foreseen.
The judgments about the severity of the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, WMD, were presented with a certainty that was not justified. Despite explicit warnings, the consequences of the invasion were underestimated. The planning and preparations for Iraq after Saddam Hussein were wholly inadequate.
While Chilcot stopped short of saying the war was illegal, Blair's decision to invade Iraq has severely tarnished his legacy. But he maintains he acted in good faith.
Good afternoon. It's claimed by some that by removing Saddam, we caused the terrorism today in the Middle East, and that it would have been better to have left him in power. I profoundly disagree.
For the current British Prime Minister, the report is an opportunity to avoid mistakes such as these in the future.
I think the most important thing we can do is to really learn the lessons for the future, and the lessons he lays out quite clearly. How do we make sure government works better, decisions are arrived at better, legal advice is considered better? All of those things, I think, are perhaps the best legacy we could seek from this whole series, so whole thing.
Iraq remains in chaos. The so-called Islamic State controls large areas of the country. Violence has spiraled in the power vacuum, left after the toppling of Saddam Hussein and the departure of coalition forces.
Chris Nineham, this report was delayed so many times. Some were saying that this would be a whitewash as a result. What are your thoughts? It's quite damning.
Yeah, it was delayed really because those who were likely to face criticism did their best to try and make it put up obstacles towards the production of the report. But I think you're right. I think it's a vindication, at least a partial vindication, of what those of us in the anti-war movement and millions of people in Britain and around the world said from the very get-go, that this was a war that was inadvisable, unnecessary, that we were taken into this war on a series of lies, and that it could only lead to catastrophe. And I think all of these things have been given further support by what's in the Chilcot report published today.
Melissa Bell, were you surprised that it was so blunt and straightforward in the end?
It was blunt and straightforward, but in a sense, it had to be. I mean, it left aside, as you said, all the legal questions, the question of the legal basis, and that's one of the crucial things that many of the families in particular would have been looking for. But on the facts, it's very difficult to see how he could avoid coming to the conclusions that he came to in the end. And it did take them 7 years to put them together. No stone was left unturned. This is an extremely exhaustive report. Something like the number of words is actually staggering. The complete works of Shakespeare times 3 I was reading today. The policy decisions have been poured over. And in a sense, the conclusion was inescapable. As we were just hearing, it's something at the time back in 2003. Everyone who watched that debate, the parliamentarians who took part in it, in the end, 1 in 4 MPs voted in favour. But many of them with a heavy heart, many of them slightly reluctantly, many of them undecided until the last minute. And everyone inside the House and watching it that day was worried about the fact that a decision was being made on evidence that we were being presented that everyone had doubts about. And the fact that history proved as quickly as it did that so many of those questions, in fact, were absolutely legitimate. And so much of what the government at the time had been telling us was full of doubt and questionable, I think has left a lot of people extremely angry. And what's in the Chilcot report is really what most people have come to the conclusion of a long time ago.
Came to the conclusion of a long time ago. Back in 2003, you're saying it was...
No, subsequently. This is, of course, not the first inquiry. There was a Hutton inquiry that looked more specifically at the war that broke out between the BBC and Downing Street at the time over those dodgy dossiers that had been sexed up, to use the terms of the day in the newspapers.
Yeah, and the BBC turned out to be right.
The BBC turned out, we lost a director general over it. The BBC lost a director general over it, but in the end felt, and many of us who worked there at the time felt that what the journalism had been correct and the methods appropriate and the conclusions true and the doubts raised factual. There was another inquiry, the Butler Review, that looked more specifically at the question of WMD and their presence in Iraq at the time. I mean, in a sense, these are questions that have been poured over so many times by inquiries, but also by MPs over the year, with the Labour Party as divided as it is by the question, the public as undecided as it remains even today, that I think, in a sense, there's almost no surprise at what's in the Chilcot inquiry. It could not be any other way.
All right. Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil, could it have been another way?
I hope it couldn't. I am yet struck by the fact that it stresses heavily Tony Blair's personal responsibility. All the facts were known, and it would have been very hard to say otherwise. But the report does not shy away from saying that Blair has personal responsibility, that it's not just the intelligence that was not fully reliable, it was not just the Commons vote, which was overwhelming at the time, in spite of the doubts that you referred to. It's not just the cabinet as a collegial body, but it's really Tony Blair and his own belief that he should stick to the US policy, that Saddam ought to be removed, and that there was no other way to go than through military intervention. And that I think is pretty clear, and that's quite harsh for Tony Blair. A lot of people already believe that he carries massive responsibility, but the fact that this is in an official report, that is a first.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And also, I think another interesting aspect, just to pick up on what you just said, is the way that it looks into particularly the sense that he had that he needed to follow the United States. I think that it looks into a number of questions. Of course, the question of the flawed intelligence, the post-war problems that hadn't been properly thought through. But it also looks very specifically at this idea that Tony Blair told George Bush, "I will back you whatever happens."
The correct quote is, "I will be with you whatever." It's something
the
he
nature
said
of that relationship worried many at the time, and I think that the Chilcot inquiry looked so deeply into it and came to the conclusions that it did, I think is really interesting.
Did you know before he became Prime Minister that Tony Blair would be that close to a Republican president of the United States?
No, of course. When his premiership began, Bill Clinton was in power. We understood that there was a solid relationship there. In the years that followed, Bill Clinton was a guest of the Labour Party conferences. That they should be close was no surprise to anyone. That he should seek such proximity with a Republican president. And at the time, the word poodle was the one that was in the press a great deal. The British worried a great deal that we were following him blindly into a war. And it was fascinating to listen to Tony Blair talk about that today. And he explains it. 9/11 changed everything. Perhaps he wouldn't have been that close to Republican president. He felt with that everything changed and he had almost no choice but to be drawn into a dynamic where he backed George Bush wherever he chose to go.
Let's listen to Tony Blair. He addressed reporters at length this Wednesday. He said he felt sorrow, he felt regret over the Iraq War, but defended his decision to join the US-led invasion of 2003.
Whereas at least in Iraq, for all its challenges, we have today a government that is elected, is recognized as internationally legitimate, and is fighting terrorism with the support of the international community. The world was and is, in my judgment, a better place without Saddam Hussein.
Chris Nynam, the world better and safer without Saddam Hussein?
Well, this is an absolute fantasy land. The truth of the matter is that Iraq is virtually a failed state. It's riven with divisions which find their origins precisely in the experience of the initial invasion and then some of the policies pursued under the occupation. But it's in the middle of a region which is now in flames. And the point at which that instability burst on the world can be dated right to the initial occupation back in 2003. And, you know, you look at the whole question of terrorism. Well, at the time of the invasion of Iraq, the jihadi groups that existed could be were essentially operating in small pockets of Central Asia, in Afghanistan, a little bit of Pakistan. Now they've spread across a whole arc of the globe, 7,000 miles actually, from Pakistan right through the Middle East, through North Africa, right down to parts of West and Central Africa, and now, of course, it's become a threat to people in Europe as well. So the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and the subsequent interventions have been absolutely catastrophic, and it's beyond belief that even now, Tony Blair is refusing to accept what everyone knows, that the whole premise of the war on terror, the whole foreign policy that followed 9/11 has been utterly catastrophic, not just for the Middle East, not just for North Africa, but really for the whole world. And you know, one of the important things about today is that we must make sure that it is a moment at which Britain and the other countries in the West re-examine their foreign policy, rethink the kind of attitudes that have dominated military strategy over the last 15 years, and end these kind of disastrous military interventions. It's absolutely critical that is one of the things that comes out of the Chilcot report today.
Chris, we're going to pick up on that point a little bit later on. I want to bring in at this point, she's a Labour Party member and political commentator. Nora Mulready joins us from New York City. Many thanks for being with us. The current Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, many say he's from the hard left of the party. Many say he wouldn't be there if it weren't for this invasion of Iraq and the division within the Labour Party over the backing of George W. Bush back in 2003. He has come out this Wednesday apologizing on behalf of the Labour Party for the Iraq War. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it was clear that Jeremy was going to do that. Jeremy may have said he was sort of speaking on behalf of the Labour Party, but he doesn't. His views certainly don't represent mine. They don't represent a lot of Labour Party members. You've probably seen the Labour MPs find actually the whole situation heartbreaking, that Jeremy is currently the spokesperson, the figurehead for what was a great party and is now, you know, really suffering.
So you're saying the Labour Party doesn't owe an apology over the Iraq War?
I mean, that is an absolutely huge question, which basically, I mean, I would echo what Tony Blair has said today. You know, Tony Blair has come out and said that he is very sorry and regretful about the loss of life and all the tragedies that have happened, but that he's not sorry took the decision that he took. He's not sorry that he removed Saddam Hussein. He's not sorry that a kind of sadistic, fascistic regime was removed from the world. And to be honest, neither am I. And so today, as a Labour Party member, Tony Blair speaks for me. And I know that he speaks for a lot of Labour members and actually a lot of people in Britain in what he said today. And Jeremy Corbyn 100% does not speak for me and 100% does not speak for all Labour Party members.
Well, he speaks for the vast majority of Labour Party members because he was elected by the vast majority of Labour Party members. And there may be some MPs and rebels like yourself who refuse to accept the democratic decisions of Labour Party members and have been challenging your leader. But the fact of the matter is that not just the overwhelming majority of Labour members and supporters, but the overwhelming majority of the British population recognise that the Iraq war was an absolute catastrophe, not just for the people in Iraq, but also for people in Britain and in Europe. And in fact, the military families, 179 of whom have lost soldiers in Iraq, they also take the view that an apology is absolutely essential. In fact, more than that, many of them believe that Tony Blair needs to face legal redress and accountability for the terrible decisions that he took. And many of the military families were actually present when Jeremy Corbyn made the statement today. So you're in a tiny minority in the Labour Party, but you're also in a tiny minority in the country at large, and I really think it's time that you accept that and accept with the rest of the world, have some humility and understand that this was a devastating decision that wrecked the lives of millions of people, literally millions of people who've been displaced, whose societies have been shredded by a series of Western interventions. And
Norm, already, very briefly, because we have to go to the break.
To admit, we have to learn some lessons from this.
Very briefly, Norm already.
Yeah, I would just ask him, what his comments are on what society was like before this in Iraq. I mean, the absolute horrors that were inflicted on a daily basis by Saddam and his regime. I mean, this is not a clear-cut case of, everything was great beforehand and then Tony Blair came along and ruined it all.
No one's arguing that. No one's arguing that.
But actually, that is
But there are many bad regimes
in
the world. But there are many bad regimes in the world. But
I'm going to have to interrupt both of you. Sorry about this. We have to go to a quick break. We'll be right back. You're watching the François debate.